Hi everybody, this is Mike. As you can probably see, it's a bit dark behind me now. It's 10 o'clock at night and I was just doing some work on one of my games and needed to do something that when I first started developing I had a few problems with, and that is the idea of an object pool. So you probably, if you've been working in Unity for a while, you'll come across a number of times where you have to instantiate an object and then you destroy it a few seconds later. Things like an enemy or a bullet or some text to display how much you've damaged the enemy. A number of different scenarios where you may want to instantiate an object but then you destroy it later on. And this has a number of downsides to doing it that way. While it does produce the results that you want, it has a bad effect on the garbage collection, and the best way to do it is really to use a pool of objects that you reuse over and over again as opposed to instantiating a new object. But if you're new to that sort of concept, it can be quite confusing. So what I've done is just set up a quick demo scene where we can replicate the garbage collection issue, and then I'll take you through how I would create a object pool for that. So you can see the scene playing behind me, and all that's happening is it's instantiating one of these objects, it's hitting this floor collider at the bottom, and then it's being destroyed. So let me just take you through quickly how that's generated, just so you understand where we are. So I've just got a garbage collection test in the hierarchy, and I've got 4 instantiation points, and they're creating some prefabs, and then I've got the destroy object collider. So let's quickly look into one of these create prefabs. So you can see we've just got a reference to the prefab. I've got a count on here so we can see how many times it's instantiated an object, just for our information really. And then in the fixed update we're calling to instantiate one of those prefabs and set that the transform of that prefab to a random range from the X and the Z, and we're just setting the Y to 10, and that essentially just instantiates 10 meters above the ground. It drops down, hits that collider and gets destroyed, and then it increases the count, which is just so we can see how many times it's done it. I've just got 4 of those running, so we instantiate quite a few objects. And then at the bottom we've got our destroy object collider. So if we look into here, on the trigger enter, we're just destroying the game object that comes in there. Obviously if you're building a game you probably want a few more checks in there, but for this sample we're just destroying the object. And the next thing we've got is a prefab, which is just, I tried to just create something that maybe like what you might do, so like an enemy or something. So I've just got a bit of text on there, and which is a Text Mesh Pro, and I've got a stool which is from one of my other videos, so I just brought that in to sort of replicate an enemy or something like that, and that's got an audio source on like you may have on your enemies. And I created a quick script, and we've got a sphere collider and a rigid body which allows it to drop down. So if we just look into this, there's nothing in here really, it's just a test script, just something. So I've got a script attached to the object, so you can see we've got a couple of variables there and a couple of routines, and that's all that makes up that. So let's have a look at the effect of all this instantiating and all this destroying. So to do that we'll need a profiler. So under Windows, if you've not used Profiler, it's a really useful tool for finding issues. It's actually how I found this issue when I first came across it. I lost many hours to this particular issue when it first happened. So let's see, there might not be enough space in here. I'll leave it, I'll bring it as a separate window. So let's just play and let's see what happens. Let's move this profiler across here so you can see what's happening. And let's just let this run for a while, so we'll maybe let this go to 1500 or something. And you can see the profiler is now gathering some information, and we're getting these sort of spikes happening. So you can see down here the memory allocation for the garbage collection is going up quite quickly, and then we're getting these spikes, and that should do. So we're about 1500, so let's just pause that and let's have a look at these spikes. So if we move our mouse over, you can see the spike, and we've got a garbage collect here, 6.63 milliseconds. If we go to the next spike, We've got another garbage collection, and we can see it's this garbage collection that is affecting it because we can turn it off over here. So if we turn off garbage collection, you can see they are the cause of these spikes. And in this particular example, because I developed for the Oculus Rift, which needs to run at 90 frames per second, the minute you drop below that 90 frames per second, asynchronous warp kicks in and it actually drops you to 45 frames per second, which can be quite jarring for the user. And again, that's actually how I first noticed this issue. So every time we hit one of these spikes, the asynchronous warp would be kicking in. So really the question is, how do we stop that from being an issue? How do we remove this issue from our code? And the best way for doing that is the idea of an object pool. So instead of destroying the object, we set the object to be inactive and we then reuse those objects over and over again. So I'll take you through that now and we'll be able to see the effect that that has. So to do that, I'm just going to duplicate this so we know that we're working on the same sort of objects, and let's just call this object pool test. And we've got these instantiation objects, and we no longer want to create prefabs, we want to call the prefabs from a pool. So I'm just going to remove that, and let's create another one called get from pool. Just create that as a script. And again, instead of destroying, we now want to deactivate. So let's just rename this just for our purposes. And let's remove the destroy, and let's add a new one called deact, if I can spell. Let's just deactivate the prefab. And we'll need something to put our object pool onto, so I'm just going to create an empty, call this object pool with a T, and let's create a new script for here. And I'll just put this at the top. Just pressing save there. The other thing we're going to need to do is, on our prefab, we're going to need some way of knowing whether it is active or not, and whether we're allowed to use it. And we could check if it's active in the hierarchy, but there may be cases where you still want that to be active in the hierarchy, but you don't want it to be an actual object. If that's not the case for you, you can just use active in hierarchy. But it's often better to just stick a boolean that you can use to track that. So I'm just going to add a new boolean into our prefab script, and we'll just call this in use, and we'll use this to track whether this object is currently being used or not. So let's do our deactivate object collider first. So when it hits this, before it was destroying, now we want it to just deactivate the object, so we don't need any of this, and we just need on trigger enter, like we did with our destroy. We just, on the on trigger enter, we destroyed the object, but instead we're going to just deactivate. So we can do other.get component and get the prefab script, and then just put in use equals false. So that means that it's no longer being used, it's not active anymore. And let's set it to false, so that will turn it off from the screen, just like it's being destroyed, but it won't actually be destroyed, so it shouldn't get picked up by the garbage collection. And the other thing we want to do then is, in instantiation, instead of instantiate an object, we want to get an object from the pool. So let's open our get from pool, and to do that we're going to need a reference to our pool. So let's do a public, what did I call that, object pool. And at the minute there's nothing inside object pool if we open that script. see object pool, there's nothing inside here, so we need to add something in. But first we can complete our reference here. So I need to add it in our get from pool script over onto each of these. And now I can just do all these at once. I'm just selecting all these objects with shift, and then you can edit the common elements inside Unity if you've not used that before. So let's create some way of returning that whatever object we do. So let's do a function that we can call that will return a game object, and we'll call this get prefab. I've called everything prefab in here, so just to keep it the same. And just for now, I'm just going to return a new game object. So we've got our function there, and in our get from pool, if we check what we were doing in our create prefab script, so in the fixed update we were instantiating an object, changing its transform and increasing the count. So we don't need the prefab anymore, but we'll take the count. So let's just I'll just copy and paste this in, and instead of instantiate here, we can get this from the object pool. So now this game object will be assigned, will go to this get prefab, which will return at the minute it returns a blank prefab, and then it will set its position. So what we need to do is have some prefabs set up here. So let's create a public game object, and this is going to be our prefab that we previously were instantiating through create prefab. And we'll need a list of game objects to select from, and we'll call this prefab list. And let's add a count as well, just so we can see how many are in the list. So just a list count. And we don't need start and we don't need update. So inside here now we can find an object in this list that is not being used, and we'll return that instead. To do that, I'm going to use link. I'm a big fan of link, it makes really nice readable code. There is a performance cost to link. I'll do it in link first, and then maybe we'll come back and I'll show you the other way that you can do this. I just really like link. So let's do game object, selected game object, and let's if you've not used link, it's definitely worth looking into, because it's really useful. From X in prefab list, prefab script. I'll go over this shortly. So we're essentially saying X is just a variable that I use. I started learning in Pascal quite a few years ago, and X, Y and Z was used. It's much more common now to use I's and M's and T's, but I've just stuck with using X's because that's what I've been using for so long. So this is just saying from X in this prefab list, where the x.getComponent prefab script in use is false, then select X, which will say essentially selects the game object that matches this where criteria, and we just want to get the first or default, so that will either return the first one it finds, or it will return default, which in our case will be null. And we can use that null to then determine whether we need a new object or not, because so when this first runs, this will look in this prefab list and this will not return anything because there's nothing in there to return. So we need to just check for that. And also, if all the objects in the list are in use, we want to instantiate a new object that we can use, because we obviously still want to instantiate an object for the code to use. So we can do if selected. I'm just going to put an ed on here. So if selected game object equals null, we know that it hasn't picked a game object, so we need to do a new one. So we can say selected game object equals instantiate our prefab, and we want to add that to the list now so that it's ready and available for you. So we can do prefab list dot add the selected game object. So we're now saying if this doesn't find a usable object, then create a new object for us to use, add it to the list so it's ready to be used again, and then we'll do something to it. So we know that we need to reactivate this object, so we can go select a game object dot set active is true because we turned it off when it hit our collider, and we need to tell the system that it is now in use as well, so that it doesn't get picked up again in this link query the next time somebody calls the get prefab. So we can do our get component again and our prefab script, and just say in use equals true. So now we actually know that we're using that object, and instead of returning a new game object, we can now return our selected game object. And that's everything that we actually need to do. So I went through that really quickly, but we'll go through over everything that's happening. So we have our top one saying get from pool. So every update it tries to get a temporary game object from the object pool get prefab. In the get prefab, it's trying to load a game object from the prefab list where the in use is set to false. If it doesn't find one, it creates a new one, it adds that to that list, it reactivates the object, and it sets it to be in use. And then we set the transform to a random transform, increase the count just so we can see how many times it's been used. And then when that hits the deactivate prefab collider, it sets the in use to false, which means it's now ready to be used again, and it deactivates the object in the hierarchy. So we should get the same result through this process that we got in our last process. So let's press play and see what happens. So let's turn off the garbage collection test so we don't run that, and let's just leave the object pool. Before that's going, I better assign the prefab. So let's put the prefab into there. Everything else is ready. So let's press play, and we should get a similar result to what we saw last time. And it's not exactly the same. I can see what's happening here. So these are going way too fast, and that's because we've got a rigid body attached to our prefab, and as that's falling the first time, the rigid body is gathering velocity, and when we deactivate it, the velocity stays attached to the rigid body, but it's just not moving anywhere. So then when we reactivate the object and move its position, it's still got the same velocity it had before. And you probably get that quite a lot when you're reusing objects, particularly something where maybe you've generated a bullet or something and you apply velocity to that bullet. You want to make sure you've removed that. So just before we return it in this object pool, we can just remove that velocity from our rigid body. So select a game object get component out, and we'll get the rigid body and set the velocity to 0, and I think that might be a vector free actually. Yeah, so the velocity is actually a vector free, so let's just do vector free.0. That essentially sets everything to 0, 0, 0, so it shouldn't have any velocity. And let's click play again here and see, and we should get the same result we had before, at least visually. So yeah, you can see now we're getting the exact same sort of look that we had before. And if we look in our object pool, oops, I never increase the count, so let's just do that as well. Every time we add a new one, let's just go list count. Let's just increase that list count by 1. Let's play again. So you can see it's generating all the prefabs into the prefab list, and it's stops now at 429, even though each of these has actually generated 600, 700 objects, our object pool is still 429 because it's reusing those objects, and you should be able to see that here. So these prefab clones are all our objects, and ever so often you can see some of them going grey as they're becoming active, and then the script's picking them up again and it's reactivating them, so you can see those coming in and out all the time there. So let's do that again, but let's look at our profiler. So let me just bring the profiler in. Just wait for this to even out, and we shouldn't see now any spikes from our garbage collection. We should see a nice steady frame rate. So let's do the same. Let's allow this to go to about 1500, which is about what we did before. And you can see the garbage collection is definitely slower than it was before, and we're not getting those big spikes that we were getting when we did our previous. So we've got to 1500 there. Let's stop that, and let's do our test again that we did before. So you can see now I'm flicking off the garbage collection. It's not actually doing anything. So we've solved that problem now. We frame rates holding roughly around 100 frames per second with the odd peak and drop in there. I think V-Sync's probably on, which is why it's holding at 100. So yeah, we've fixed that issue. We can compare that again now just to make sure that we've fixed it. So if we run our garbage collection test here, just let this run for a little while. You can see all these spikes coming up again. So exactly as we had before, and the garbage collection is increasing really quick. Obviously this is an extreme example, but over the course of your game you will have multiple things spawning and being destroyed. So that's it. That's how you use object pools. It should be everything you need to know that. If you're happy using link, what I'll do is quickly go over, if you don't want to use link, you can use a for loop. So I'll just quickly go over that just so you've got a reference on that, just because I said I would. So if I open up the scripts, so in our get prefabs, now link is more expensive. I think behind the scenes it's actually just doing for loops, and it's going through and resorting and collecting all the information that it needs, but it goes through the entire list before it returns anything due to the way the where clauses work and stuff. So I think it costs a bit more on performance than just using a for loop. So let's do for int I equals 0, I is less than the prefab list dot count and I plus plus. So instead of oops, I just need to capital it. So instead of using the link like this, we're just essentially going to loop through the entire list until we meet an object that matches our criteria, and then we're just going to return that object. So we can now go if prefab list I get components prefab script so we just check the object. We go, if it's in use, it's false, then we're happy with that, and we're going to use that object, and then we want to perform these actions on it. So we can just, let me just take this so I don't have to type it every time, and we can do set active to true, and get the component rigid body. Again, let me just copy and paste this just so I don't have to type it again. And we've done that in use, and then let's just return that prefab. So it's coming in here now, it's finding the first one that it wants and it's returning, which is essentially going to end this script. So it's not going to go through the entire list, it's just going to go through that one. So what we need to do now is we're not actually selecting a game object down here. We know that it's null at this point because it's got through the entire list and it's not returned anything. So we don't have to check if it's null, and we need to do a new game object. So let's do I'll just leave the name the same. So if it gets to this point, it can instantiate a new prefab, add it to the list, increase the count, set the values, and return that new game object. And that should work exactly the same as it did previously. So if we just check that's working. So there you can see it's doing the exact same thing. This should stop. I say it's doing it. Did I not change the rigid body? Why is that not doing that? So it's coming in here, it's in user's fault. Oh, I never actually set it to, I never do the in use stuff. Let's just do that now. Let's try again. It's always something you miss when you're typing again. So our object pool should hold steady and everything's coming down now. So you can see it's working exactly the same. It's holding at 429. You can see these flashing on and off as they get used and then get reused. And if I bring this over here, you can see our garbage collection is no longer causing any spikes. So there you go, that's object pools. You would obviously, if you need to use multiple object pools, you can add them all in here, give them much better names than I've done. And if you've got a lot of object pools where they've got a lot of objects in, it is probably better to use a for loop. It's just not quite as pretty as using link. I just like link just because it's simple to read, so I tend to use that where I can and leave the other stuff. So I hope that was useful for you. If you've got any comments or questions, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you shortly. Thank you.